Growing up is usually described as a slow and steady rise into understanding, but for Morty Smith it begins more like a tiny tear inside him, a split that he is too young to name, but old enough to feel. When you watch him in his earliest adventures, before he even realizes he is living in the shadow of a cosmic storm, you can sense something trembling underneath the surface. It is not fear of aliens or fear of danger. It is the quiet dread of realizing the world is larger, sharper, and far less forgiving than he was prepared for. Every child eventually learns this, but Morty learns it in fast forward, pulled through realities that twist the very idea of safety. His fear of growing up does not begin with trauma, it begins with scale. The universe is too big and he is too small, and the gap between those truths becomes the first fracture inside him. He wants to believe in childhood. He wants to believe the world will stay the size of his house, his school, his neighborhood. But every time Rick calls his name from the garage, that world expands in ways he never asked for. He sees planets ruled by brutality, creatures shaped by suffering, timelines where life sprouts and ends with mechanical cruelty. He sees versions of himself that did not survive, versions of his family that never existed, versions of his choices that ripple into catastrophe. For most teenagers, growing up means learning that the world is unfair. For Morty, growing up means learning that unfairness is woven into the fabric of existence. He cannot pretend there is a safe edge anymore. He has seen beyond it. And once you see beyond the edge, childhood becomes a costume that no longer fits. Morty tries to hold on to it. He tries to cling to the simplicity of crushes, homework, video games, and family dinners. He wants to carve out pockets of normalcy, small moments that feel like the life he was supposed to have. The tragedy is that he can still reach those moments, but they no longer reach him. Something inside him has shifted. When you stand in front of infinity, small joys start to carry an aftertaste of fragility. Morty senses that fragility even before he understands it. He senses that everything he loves is breakable, temporary, dissolving. He senses that safety is not a fact, but a passing mood. This is the fear that begins to shape him, not fear of monsters or fear of pain, but the fear that innocence can never be restored once it is lost. Rick never explains this to him. Rick does not need to. His entire presence embodies that truth. He walks through universes knowing exactly how disposable everything is. But Morty is not Rick. He cannot carry that knowledge with cold detachment. For Morty, the knowledge leaks into his emotions. It colors his relationships. It makes him hold people tighter while simultaneously expecting to lose them. Growing up becomes synonymous with loss, and loss becomes synonymous with adulthood. Of course, Morty fears growing up. He is being taught that growing up means letting go of parts of yourself that you were never ready to lose. Morty's fear also comes from the way responsibility is forced upon him. He sees Rick act with brilliance, but without caution, without empathy, without breaks. Someone has to compensate, someone has to humanize the chaos, and more often than not, Morty tries. Not because he wants to, but because there is no one else who can. He becomes the emotional stabilizer, the ethical boundary, the person who notices when a line has been crossed. That should never be the role of a child. When a teenager becomes the conscience of an adult, something in that teenager fractures. Morty learns to apologize for situations he did not create. He learns to comfort people who hurt him. He learns to swallow fear in order to protect others. These are adult skills, adult burdens, and they reach him far too soon. There is also a deeper layer to Morty's fear, something quieter and more personal. Growing up means becoming independent. It means stepping out from behind someone else's authority, someone else's logic, someone else's understanding of the world. Morty knows that Rick is a genius, and that genius casts a long shadow. Being around someone who understands everything makes you feel like you understand nothing. Morty fears growing up because adulthood requires self-trust. and he has been taught to defer to Rick's perspective even when it destroys him. He has been taught that his instincts are naive, his emotions are childish, his doubts are irrational. Every time Rick dismisses him, corrects him, or mocks him, Morty's ability to trust his own future self erodes a little more. How do you grow into someone you respect when the most powerful figure in your life keeps implying that your ideas are meaningless? Morty's fear is not rooted in incompetence or immaturity. It is rooted in the belief that adulthood will demand strength he is not sure he possesses. And the more he travels with Rick, the more he sees what adulthood looks like when brilliance goes unchecked. He sees Rick's loneliness, Rick's numbness, Rick's inability to stay still in his own mind. Morty looks at that, and he wonders if growing up means becoming someone who stops feeling, someone who stops hoping, someone who survives instead of living. That possibility terrifies him more than any alien threat ever could. Yet Morty is not weak. His fear is not cowardice. His fear is sensitivity, and sensitivity in a world like his becomes a wound that never fully closes. He reacts deeply to everything because he cares deeply about everything. Growing up often requires emotional walls. Morty was never given time to build them. He went straight from innocence to exposure, from childhood to cosmic horror. No buffer, no transition, no preparation. When that happens, fear becomes the only shield you have, until you can learn a different one. Morty also carries fear because growing up means making choices
that define you, and he has already made choices that haunt him, choices that ripple across timelines, choices that take lives, choices that cannot be reversed. He sees adulthood as a place where mistakes have consequences that do not get erased by mourning, a place where one moment of weakness can become your legacy. Rick treats consequences as inconveniences. Morty feels them as guilt, and guilt becomes another anchor holding him back from embracing the future. There is a heartbreaking truth in Morty's character. He does not fear growing up because he is childish. He fears growing up because he has already grown up too fast. He has carried responsibility too early, witnessed too much death, and learned too many harsh truths. Childhood slipped away from him in pieces, scattered across dimensions, and he is left trying to gather what remains. Every time he reaches for a normal day, something abnormal interrupts it. Every time he tries to be a kid, something forces him into a role he is not ready for. Growing up becomes a reminder of everything he lost when he wasn't looking. And yet, even with all this fear, Morty still tries. He still searches for stability, for affection, for laughter, for meaning. That effort speaks to a resilience he does not realize he has. If Morty truly feared growing up without hope, he would shut down. Instead, he keeps looking for reasons to care, reasons to trust, reasons to become better. His fear does not stop him. It slows him just enough to show how much he still values the innocence he has left. In a way, the fear keeps him human. It keeps him gentle. It keeps him aware of the importance of small things in a universe filled with chaos. Morty's fear of growing up is not a flaw. It is a response to an overwhelming world, a world he did not choose but must navigate anyway. He grows even when he does not want to. He learns even when the lessons hurt. He adapts even when the changes terrify him. That is what makes Morty compelling. He fears growing up, but he moves toward it anyway. Every day, every adventure, every mistake, he becomes a little stronger in ways he cannot see yet. His fear is real, but so is his courage. And in the quiet moments when he is lying in bed trying to make sense of everything he has seen, he holds onto one fragile hope, the hope that growing up does not mean losing himself, the hope that adulthood can be something different from what Rick represents, the hope that he can become someone who feels deeply without collapsing, someone who understands the universe without being crushed by it, someone who grows without breaking. That hope is small, but it is enough to keep him moving toward the future, even as it scares him.
Morty never has a single turning point where his childhood ends. There is no dramatic moment that declares itself as the line between who he was and who he is becoming. Instead, there is a slow dimming, a gradual shrinking of the world that once felt safe. Every adventure with Rick steals a fraction of that safety. Sometimes it is obvious, sometimes it is invisible, but the effect is always the same. The space where childhood used to live becomes smaller, and Morty feels that shrinkage in ways he cannot articulate. It settles into him like a quiet pressure, shaping the way he moves through his days. He starts noticing it at school first. He sits in class and listens to teachers talk about equations and vocabulary, but his mind drifts toward things that no one else in that room would ever understand. He hears someone mention the solar system, and he thinks about stars he has seen up close. He hears someone joke about parallel worlds, and he thinks about the weight of living among your own variations. He hears someone complain about homework, and he thinks about the memory of running for his life on worlds that do not even exist anymore. The distance between his classmates and himself expands. Morty wants to be part of their conversations, part of their jokes, part of their ordinary anxieties. He wants to be a normal kid, but his mind has seen too much. The innocence that school assumes he no longer possesses. This gap creates a quiet loneliness inside him, not the loud kind that comes from abandonment, but the subtle kind that comes from feeling out of sync with the people around you. Morty begins to notice that he laughs at jokes a moment too late. He gets distracted during conversations. He zones out when someone is telling him about their day because his mind is stuck on something terrifying he cannot share. It is not that he wants to be distant. It is that some part of him is still catching up to everything he has witnessed. He carries a backlog of emotions he has not yet processed, and they spill over into his daily life. Growing up usually involves confusion, but Morty's confusion is multiplied by the presence of truths he cannot unsee. At home, the change appears in softer ways. He looks at his mother and wants to tell her what he has been through. He wants comfort, wants reassurance, wants someone to tell him that things will be all right. But he knows that his stories would only cause panic. He knows she cannot comprehend what he has seen, and he knows Rick would mock him if he tried to open up, so he swallows it. He eats dinner with a smile and tries to pretend that everything feels normal. He listens to conversations about chores and work schedules and school dances and tries to root himself in them. He tries to pretend the world is only as big as the dining room table. The act is comforting for a moment, but the comfort fades once he is alone again. That smallness cannot hold him anymore, not after everything. Morty also begins to sense the time is moving faster than he expected, not in a literal sense, but in the emotional sense that comes from being stretched between different versions of himself. He experiences fear, bravery, disappointment, hope, and despair at speeds that do not match the calendar on the fridge. Some days he feels older than he should be. Other days he feels younger than everyone expects. Growing up becomes this uneven process, a tug of war between who he was and who he is supposed to become. That inconsistency frightens him. He does not know which version of himself is the real one. He worries that the universe is shaping him faster than he can shape himself. And Rick, without realizing it, feeds this fear constantly. Rick moves through life with the confidence of someone who believes he has outgrown everything. He treats emotional development as an inconvenience. Whenever Morty asks questions that come from the heart, Rick brushes them aside. Whenever Morty tries to express fear, Rick dismisses it. Whenever Morty feels guilty, Rick calls it unnecessary. Morty is stuck in a strange place where he feels emotions intensely while being taught that emotions are weaknesses. That contradiction twists him. It makes him question every instinct. It makes him wonder if his feelings are childish or if Rick's lack of feelings is the true immaturity. Morty does not know which answer is right. He only knows that the conflict muddles his sense of who he is becoming. This confusion heightens his fear of growing up. If adulthood means being more like Rick, Morty is terrified. If adulthood means losing sensitivity, he is terrified. If adulthood means becoming numb to the suffering of others, he is terrified. Morty sees what emotional detachment looks like when pushed to cosmic scale. He sees the cost of intellect when it is not balanced by empathy. He sees the isolation that comes from believing you are above everyone else. Rick embodies these consequences. Morty sees them clearly, and he fears walking that same path, even in miniature. Morty's fear also grows from the complexity of choices he is asked to make. Most teenagers struggle with decisions about school, friends, and identity. Morty struggles with decisions that affect entire worlds. His mistakes do not end with embarrassment or a bad grade. They end with casualties. They end with timelines that cannot be repaired. They end with people who will never go home again. The gravity of these decisions settles into him slowly, wearing down his confidence. He starts worrying about every choice because every choice reminds him of something irreversible he once caused. This hyper-awareness makes him cautious in ordinary life. He hesitates before speaking. He overthinks simple interactions. He second-guesses harmless actions because he has learned that small moments can become enormous consequences. That is not a lesson a child should learn so young, but Morty has no control over the speed of his lessons.
Another factor deepens his fear. Morty senses that Rick needs him, not in an affectionate way, but in a functional way. Morty becomes the emotional ballast that keeps Rick from floating entirely off the moral map. Morty becomes the person who occasionally stops Rick from stepping too far into destruction. Morty becomes the witness that keeps Rick accountable, even when Rick refuses to acknowledge it. That dynamic creates a pressure Morty is not ready for. Being needed by someone who refuses to admit they need anyone is disorienting. Morty does not want that responsibility, yet he carries it because he knows that without it, things might spiral even faster. Being essential in such a subtle yet heavy way makes him feel older than he wants to feel. It makes him realize that growing up is not a choice. It is something that life demands from him faster than he can prepare for. Sometimes Morty tries to reclaim parts of his childhood. He tries to play games, tries to laugh with his friends, tries to get excited about simple pleasures. But even in those moments, fear hides underneath the surface. He fears that joy will not last. He fears that normal days are temporary pauses, not permanent states. He fears that the next trip with Rick will take another piece of him he cannot recover. Joy becomes bittersweet because it carries the knowledge of its own fragility. Morty does not want to rush through life. He wants to linger in the small comforts. But the knowledge of how quickly comfort can be interrupted haunts him. There is a moment he experiences often, though he never speaks about it. It happens late at night, when the house is quiet and the world outside his window feels calm. He lies in bed and stares at the ceiling, reviewing everything he has lived through that day. Some memories make him laugh softly. Others make him flinch. Others make him feel nothing at all because he has not yet figured out how to understand them. These nights reveal the crux of his fear. He feels suspended between two identities. One identity clings to childhood because childhood still promises safety. The other identity inches toward adulthood because he knows he cannot avoid it. The tension between these identities keeps him awake. It creates a restlessness that has no name. Morty wants a future he can trust. But trust requires stability, and his life has none. Growing up usually involves imagining who you want to become. Morty cannot do that because every version of the future feels uncertain. Every version of adulthood he can picture is shaped by Rick's influence, and none of those versions seem peaceful. He is afraid he will lose the softness that makes him human. He is afraid that surviving will replace living. He is afraid that his mistakes will define him before he has a chance to define himself. These fears form the landscape of his inner world. Yet Morty's fear is paired with a rare emotional clarity. He sees himself honestly. He knows he is not ready for adulthood. He knows he is overwhelmed. He knows he is changing in ways he did not consent to, and that honesty, painful as it is, becomes the root of his growth. Morty may fear the future, but he does not lie to himself about it. He does not retreat into denial. He faces the fear even when it hurts. That willingness to confront discomfort is what will eventually help him grow into someone strong, someone reflective, someone capable of breaking cycles rather than repeating them. Morty's fear is not a permanent flaw. It is a temporary shadow cast by the speed of his experiences. One day he will find balance. One day he will find a version of adulthood that does not resemble Rick's mistakes. One day he will discover that growing up does not have to mean losing his compassion. But in this chapter of his life, the shadow still covers him. He walks with it quietly, learning to carry its weight until he becomes strong enough to disperse it. When Morty finally drifts into sleep, the fear does not vanish. It softens. It becomes something he can manage, something he can live with. He knows the morning will bring new challenges, new questions, new moments where he must pretend to be older than he feels. But he also knows he has not surrendered. He still wants to understand himself. He still wants to find meaning. He still wants to believe that growing up can lead to something better. That desire is small but steady, and it guides him through the uncertainty of adolescence. Morty fears growing up because life has given him too many reasons to fear change. But fear, when carried with awareness, can become a teacher. And Morty, without realizing it, is already learning more than he gives himself credit for.
Morty does not remember the exact moment when knowledge stopped feeling exciting and started feeling heavy. There was a time when leaving the house with Rick felt like opening a door to endless possibility. There was a time when the unknown felt thrilling. But thrill is a fragile thing, and in Morty's case it dissolves slowly under the pressure of understanding. Not intellectual understanding, but emotional comprehension, the kind that sinks into your bones. Morty sees more than he should. He processes more than he can handle. He learns things about the universe that no teenager should ever be forced to absorb. And as each truth settles inside him, the weight increases. It grows quietly, layer upon layer, until it becomes something he carries constantly. This weight changes the way he sees everything. Ordinary moments become reminders of extraordinary dangers. Simple conflicts become echoes of cosmic threats. Even silence becomes a space where memories return without permission. When Morty sits at his desk in school, trying to focus on a simple task, his mind drifts toward images that do not belong in a classroom. He sees cities falling under forces beyond comprehension. He sees creatures shaped by instincts he cannot imagine. He sees versions of himself that do not exist anymore. He knows that these memories do not belong here, yet he cannot detach from them. They linger, creating a pressure behind his thoughts. It is hard to take adolescence seriously when you have seen what the universe does to entire civilizations. Morty begins to understand that knowledge has a cost. Once you learn certain truths, innocence becomes unreachable. He tries to pretend that he is still a kid who worries about tests and crushes, but the illusion never lasts. Knowledge rises like a tide inside him, pulling him away from the shore of childhood. It is a slow pull, but it is constant. Even when he laughs at a joke or gets absorbed in a game, there is a quiet awareness that the world is more complex, more unpredictable, and more hostile than anyone around him realizes. He carries that awareness silently, trying not to let it reshape him too quickly. The scariest part for Morty is that he cannot control the pace of his learning. He cannot choose which truths to face or which moments to run from. Rick drags him into situations where knowledge hits like a wave instead of a drizzle. Morty is forced to adapt in real time. He is forced to understand things while he is still processing fear. This combination fuses knowledge with emotion, creating memories that are not just facts, but sensations that reappear when he least expects them. Morty does not simply know the universe is dangerous, he feels it, and feeling too much, too soon, distorts the path of growing up. Morty also realizes that some knowledge isolates him. When he looks at his classmates, he sees their innocence as a barrier he can no longer cross. He envies their ignorance. He envies the simplicity of their concerns. Yet he also knows he can never return to that space. The distance makes him feel older and younger at the same time. Older because he carries burdens they cannot imagine. Younger because the weight overwhelms him in ways he cannot manage. He feels suspended between two emotional ages, unable to settle comfortably in either one. Rick contributes to this predicament, but not out of cruelty. Rick sees knowledge as a tool, not a burden. Rick has learned to detach emotionally from information that should be devastating. Rick sees the universe without flinching, and he expects Morty to develop the same resilience. Morty tries to imitate that detachment, but imitation only works on the surface. Inside, he remains someone who feels deeply. Inside, knowledge becomes heavy instead of liberating. Rick's resilience becomes another source of pressure. Morty begins to fear that he will never be able to process information the way Rick does, and that fear becomes another weight added to the collection. Morty also senses that knowledge shifts his identity. As he learns more about the universe, he becomes less certain about who he is supposed to become. He used to think adulthood meant getting a job, making friends, falling in love, building a stable life. But now he wonders if adulthood is even possible for someone who has seen so much instability. He wonders if growing up means becoming someone who can navigate uncertainty without collapsing. He wonders if he is strong enough for that. Knowledge forces him to question his future, but not in the normal way teenagers question theirs. Morty does not wonder what he will be. He wonders if he can be anything at all without falling apart. There is another aspect to his fear. Morty begins to notice that knowledge changes his reactions. He no longer jumps at small dangers, but he freezes when faced with ones that remind him of experiences he has not processed. A sound, a shape, a phrase, even a smell, can trigger memories that drag him into a state he does not understand. These reactions confuse him. They make him feel out of control. He wonders if he is becoming weaker, when in reality he is simply overwhelmed. His body remembers things before his mind can interpret them. Growing up is supposed to give you more control, not less. But Morty feels the opposite. The more he knows, the more unpredictable his emotions become. Morty also understands that knowledge alters his relationships. He sees things in Rick that he did not used to notice. He sees the cracks behind Rick's confidence, the exhaustion behind his intelligence, the loneliness behind his remarks. This awareness makes Morty sympathetic, but it also makes him afraid. He realizes that Rick lives with knowledge that has taken a toll on him. He sees what decades of cosmic awareness have done to Rick's mental state. Morty wonders if this is his own future. He wonders if knowledge is not just heavy, but corrosive. The thought terrifies him. He does not want to end up emotionally hollow. He does not want to carry so much truth that he becomes numb to all of it. Morty also begins to recognize that knowledge reshapes morality. When you know how vast the universe is, human ethics begin to feel small. Choices that once seemed simple become complicated when seen through multiple lenses. Morty learns that right and wrong are not always clear, and that knowledge often removes the comfort of certainty. This ambiguity confuses him. He wants to do the right thing, but he has learned that the right thing sometimes leads to unintended harm. He begins to doubt his instincts. He begins to hesitate in moments that require action. Hesitation becomes another weight, pressing on him at the worst times. Morty's fear of growing up deepens every time a decision reminds him of consequences he did not foresee. He learns too much about how chaos spreads, how small actions ripple, how intentions mean little in the face of complex systems. Knowledge becomes a shadow, following him into every choice, whispering reminders about what can go wrong. This shadow does not leave him alone. It sharpens his anxiety and blurs his confidence. The worst part is that Morty cannot share this knowledge with anyone. When he tries to talk about his experiences, he is either dismissed, misunderstood, or silenced to avoid panic. Knowledge becomes something he must carry quietly. Secrets become another weight on his shoulders. Morty feels the tension of wanting to confide in someone, but being unable to do so. It is a lonely feeling, one that makes growing up feel even more intimidating. Despite all this, Morty does not reject knowledge. He does not try to forget what he has learned. He absorbs it, slowly, painfully, with the kind of resilience that is easy to overlook. Even when the weight becomes too much, Morty keeps moving forward. He tries to understand himself. He tries to make sense of the universe. He tries to grow without letting knowledge turn him cold. There is a quiet strength in Morty's journey. He carries truths that could break someone twice his age, yet he remains emotionally alive. He still cares. He still fears. He still hopes. Knowledge does not destroy him. It challenges him, and every time he confronts that challenge, he grows in ways he does not recognize yet. Morty fears growing up because he knows that adulthood will bring even more knowledge, even more responsibility, even more emotional complexity. But he also senses that avoiding knowledge will not save him. The only way forward is through understanding, even if that understanding hurts. At night, when he lies awake replaying the events of the day, Morty feels the weight of everything he knows. It presses on him, but it does not crush him. It shapes him. Slowly, steadily, it teaches him how to hold truth without losing himself. Morty does not realize it yet, but this ability is what will eventually make him strong. Not strong in Rick's way, but strong in a way that only someone who feels deeply can be. Knowledge is heavy, but Morty carries it. And that alone is proof that he is growing, even if he fears what that growth means.
Morty grows up in a world where responsibility arrives before readiness. Most teenagers take small steps into responsibility. They start with chores, schoolwork, friendships, and early choices about identity. Morty does not get that gradual path. His steps are giant, uneven, and unpredictable. Some days he is pulled into situations where the fate of entire species rests on decisions he barely understands. Other days he returns home to find homework waiting on his desk, as if nothing unusual happened. The contrast is disorienting. Responsibility becomes a mirror that Morty is forced to look into before he is prepared to see his own reflection, and what he sees in that mirror frightens him more than any alien creature ever could. Responsibility should develop with emotional maturity, but Morty faces responsibilities that exceed anything his emotions are ready to handle. He becomes responsible for Rick's safety in subtle moments. He becomes responsible for navigating conflicts that would overwhelm most adults. He becomes responsible for managing his own panic when panic could get him killed. This creates a distorted version of growing up, one where responsibility is not tied to capability but to circumstance. Morty does not take responsibility because he is ready for it. He takes responsibility because there is no one else to carry it, and this imbalance begins to shape how he sees himself. It starts with small actions that seem harmless. Morty reminds Rick to focus when Rick gets lost in thought. He tries to calm down situations when Rick's impatience threatens to escalate them. At first, these behaviors feel insignificant. Morty thinks he is just helping, but over time, he realizes he has slipped into a role that requires constant emotional effort. Rick does not ask Morty to be responsible for him, but the unspoken expectation grows. Morty begins to anticipate Rick's moods, to soften Rick's sharpness when necessary, to shoulder emotional tasks that go unnoticed by others. This emotional labor is subtle, invisible, and exhausting. It makes Morty feel older than he is, yet it gives him no confidence in his own maturity. Morty also starts to internalize the idea that he must protect people from the consequences of Rick's actions. He notices that Rick rarely acknowledges the harm he causes. Rick treats chaos as routine and danger as entertainment. Morty sees the aftermath. Morty sees the frightened faces of strangers. Morty sees the anger of people who were caught in the crossfire. Morty tries to apologize, to mend what he can, to salvage dignity where none was left. These attempts often fail, but Morty feels compelled to try anyway. Responsibility becomes something he absorbs through empathy rather than logic. He cares, therefore he feels responsible. This instinct is pure, but it becomes heavier with time. The fear of growing up intensifies when Morty starts to realize responsibility has consequences he cannot predict. Every time he makes
a decision, he worries about what might unravel. He has seen the worst-case scenarios too often. He knows that even a minor misstep can change the course of an entire world. This fear follows him like a shadow, whispering doubts into every choice. Morty hesitates more often, not because he lacks courage, but because he is aware of the weight behind even the smallest action. That awareness creates a burden that most adults do not even carry, and Morty is forced to bear it while still learning how to navigate his own emotions. Morty's fear deepens when responsibility collides with guilt. He remembers the times when things went wrong because of a split-second decision. He remembers pleading with Rick while watching a situation collapse. He remembers promises he could not keep. These memories do not leave him. They settle into him and begin shaping his expectations of himself. Morty starts to believe he is always one mistake away from disaster. He becomes terrified of disappointing people, terrified of causing harm, terrified of being the reason someone else suffers. This fear is not rational, but it grows from experiences that left emotional scars. Responsibility becomes linked not to pride, but to dread. Morty also notices that responsibility changes how people treat him. Rick, for all his detachment, begins to rely on Morty more often. Rick expects Morty to keep up. Rick expects Morty to understand. Rick expects Morty to make decisions when Rick is too distracted or too indifferent to make them himself. Morty is given little praise for this. Instead, he is rewarded with more responsibility. This dynamic teaches Morty a painful lesson. Being responsible does not make life easier. It makes life heavier. It makes him more visible in moments of crisis and less visible in moments of calm. That imbalance makes him fear adulthood even more, because adulthood seems to promise endless responsibility with little emotional support. Morty's family adds another layer to his burden. When he comes home after a dangerous adventure, he cannot express what he went through. He cannot explain why he feels older. He cannot tell them that he had to make choices that felt like life or death. They see a teenage boy. They see someone who should be worrying about grades, not galaxies. Morty feels trapped between their perception and his reality. He tries to play the role of a normal kid, but the act requires effort he does not always have. Responsibility becomes a secret, something he carries alone. Growing up becomes frightening because it feels like a path he must walk without guidance. Morty also begins to understand that responsibility does not always lead to positive growth. Sometimes it leads to emotional fatigue. Morty feels tired in ways he cannot explain. He feels drained even when he does nothing physically demanding. He feels like he is constantly bracing for the next crisis. This exhaustion makes him fear the future because he cannot imagine living an entire life with the same emotional pressure. He wonders if adulthood means accepting constant fatigue. He wonders if there will ever be a time when he can simply breathe without anticipating the next disaster. Despite all this, Morty does not avoid responsibility. He does not reject it. He does not try to run from the roles thrust upon him. Instead, he tries to rise to the occasion. He tries to make thoughtful choices. He tries to protect people. He tries to remain compassionate. This effort speaks to a deeper truth about Morty. Even when responsibility scares him, he does not abandon it. He tries to fulfill it with integrity. This makes him stronger than he realizes, but it also deepens his fear. Morty understands that responsibility has become a core part of who he is, and that realization makes him worry about the weight he will carry as an adult. Morty also struggles with the moral implications of responsibility. He wants to do the right thing, but he has learned that the right thing is not always obvious. Sometimes responsibility requires choosing the lesser of two harms. Sometimes it requires trusting instinct over reason. Sometimes it requires acting even when he is terrified. These moments teach him that responsibility is not a path to certainty. It is a path to difficult choices. Morty fears growing up because adulthood seems full of decisions without clear answers, and he has already made too many of them. There is a moment he experiences often, though he never speaks about it. After a dangerous mission, when he is lying in bed trying to relax, he thinks about the roles he played that day. He thinks about the moments he stepped forward when he wanted to step back. He thinks about the decisions he made even when his hands were shaking. In this quiet reflection, he feels both proud and overwhelmed. He wonders if he will always be the one to step forward. He wonders if anyone will ever step forward for him. This thought makes his chest tighten. Responsibility feels one-sided, and he fears that growing up will only magnify that imbalance. Yet Morty possesses something remarkable. He understands responsibility as something tied to compassion, not obligation. He acts because he cares, not because he seeks recognition. He tries to protect people because their fear resonates with him. This empathy makes him strong in ways he does not yet understand. It also gives him a path forward. Morty will never become someone who treats responsibility as a burden to avoid. He will become someone who uses responsibility to bring meaning to his actions. His fear of growing up is not a rejection of adulthood. It is a recognition of the weight adulthood carries. It is the understanding that responsibility shapes lives, and Morty wants to be shaped by it in a way that preserves his humanity. He fears becoming numb. He fears losing sensitivity. He fears carrying responsibility without support. But he also believes somewhere deep inside that he can grow and
without losing himself. At night, when the house is quiet and he is alone with his thoughts, Morty feels the weight of everything he is responsible for. It sits heavy on his chest, but it does not crush him. It becomes something he studies, something he learns from. Responsibility still scares him, but he does not run from it. He faces it with trembling hands and a determined heart, and that is what makes him grow, even in fear.
Morty has always carried a small spark inside him, a spark that survives even the darkest journeys. It is not optimism in the cheerful sense. It is not denial of the dangers around him. It is something quieter, something more delicate. Morty holds onto hope in a fragile way, almost instinctively, like a child gripping the last piece of a toy that reminded him of simpler days. This hope is not loud or confident. It arrives in soft moments, in small gestures, in the part of Morty that still believes there is something worth saving in the universe. As he grows, this hope becomes one of the most complicated emotions he carries, because hope requires vulnerability, and vulnerability becomes harder to protect the more he sees. This fragility appears in the way Morty treats strangers. Even when they belong to species he does not understand, he tries to give them the benefit of the doubt. He wants to believe that most beings, no matter how strange, hold some piece of goodness within them. This belief often gets shaken by the realities he faces. He encounters worlds where kindness is irrelevant, where violence is instinct, where survival overrides morality. Each encounter chips away at his trust, yet the hope never fully disappears. It shrinks, but it endures. Morty fears growing up because adulthood seems like the place where hope finally dies. where experience erodes softness until nothing remains. He sees evidence of this in Rick. Rick is brilliant, powerful, and unshakable, yet hope is absent from him. When Morty looks at Rick, he sees a possible future he does not want. Morty tries to hold on to hope because it keeps him connected to the person he wants to be. When he helps someone, even in small ways, he feels a sense of purpose that pushes back against the chaos. But even this purpose becomes fragile as he grows. Morty begins to understand that hope does not guarantee results. He can try to save people and still fail. He can try to do good and still cause harm. He can put his heart into a moment and still watch it collapse. These failures weigh on him, not because they prove hope is pointless, but because they force him to question how long he can keep believing without breaking. Morty's hope is fragile also because it is constantly tested in unpredictable ways. Every trip with Rick holds a new challenge that threatens to extinguish that spark. He sees destruction on scales he cannot comprehend. He sees cruelty that appears meaningless. He sees beings who exist without empathy. These experiences make hope feel naive. Morty knows this, but he cannot give it up. Something inside him resists the idea that cynicism is the only mature response. He worries, though. He worries that holding on to hope will make him look foolish, especially to Rick. He worries that growing up will force him to choose between innocence and wisdom. He worries that hope will not survive the weight of knowledge. The fragility of hope becomes clear at home, too. Morty watches. The people around him argue, misunderstand each other, and repeat patterns they cannot escape. He wants to believe his family can grow. He wants to believe they can become more patient, more understanding, more stable. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they share moments of genuine connection, but other times they collapse into chaos that feels too familiar. Morty feels caught between love and disappointment. He hopes for better days, but he fears that hoping makes him vulnerable to disappointment he cannot handle. Growing up means accepting the flaws of others without letting those flaws define your outlook. But Morty struggles with that balance. Morty also realizes that hope makes him brave. He tries to protect people because he believes they deserve protection. He tries to stand up for himself because he believes his voice matters. He tries to confront challenges because he believes there is a chance things might turn out well. This bravery is not born from confidence but from hope. Yet bravery takes a toll. Every time Morty faces something terrifying, every time he puts himself at risk, every time he holds on to hope in a situation where most people would give up, he feels the emotional strain afterward. Hope becomes exhausting, especially when the world rarely rewards it. There are moments when Morty questions whether hope is worth the pain it brings. He wonders if he should start adopting Rick's outlook, if abandoning hope might reduce the emotional fallout he experiences after difficult missions. But he knows deep down that he is not built to be detached. He cares too deeply. He feels too strongly. Giving up hope would mean giving up a core part of himself. The thought frightens him. Growing up begins to look like a threat to his identity. He fears that the more he sees, the more likely he is to become someone he does not recognize. Morty's hope is fragile in another way too. It is often tied to specific people. He hopes Rick will change, even slightly. He hopes his family will become more stable. He hopes his sister will find her place. He hopes his mother will find peace. He hopes his father will find confidence. These hopes make him feel connected to the people he loves, but they also make him vulnerable to disappointment. Morty cares for his family deeply, even when he is frustrated with them. He dreams of a future where they support each other, but the reality of their flaws makes this dream uncertain. Each disappointment chips away at his hope, yet he clings to it because it provides emotional continuity in a life that constantly shifts. The most fragile hope Morty carries is the hope that he will become someone capable of handling everything he has experienced. He wants to believe he can grow without losing compassion.
He wants to believe he can understand the universe without becoming numb. He wants to believe he can be strong without becoming cold. This hope is delicate because Morty sees how easily people lose themselves to fear, power, or pain. He sees how quickly someone can change when confronted with overwhelming force. Morty does not want that fate. He hopes he can break the cycle, but hope alone cannot guarantee it, and this uncertainty feeds his fear of growing up. There is a moment Morty experiences often, one that reveals the core of his fragile hope. After a chaotic adventure, when he sits quietly in his room trying to calm his heartbeat, he reflects on the parts of the day that made him feel despair and the parts that made him feel connected. Sometimes these moments are small. A stranger he managed to rescue, a creature he comforted, a choice he made that prevented harm. These small victories matter to him because they affirm that his hope was not misplaced. They show him that even in a universe filled with danger, his actions can create meaning. These moments are fragile. They flicker. They are easy to forget when fear takes over. But Morty memorizes them because they help him understand himself. They help him believe that he is not powerless. They help him believe that he is capable of shaping situations, even when he feels overwhelmed. Hope becomes a memory he carries forward, reminding him that his compassion does make a difference, even if the difference is small. Morty fears growing up because adulthood seems to demand a kind of emotional durability he does not possess yet. He worries that the universe will push him to abandon hope, and that without it, he will become someone he does not want to be. But Morty does not realize something important. Hope does not need to be unbreakable to matter. Hope can be fragile and still guide him. Hope can be small and still illuminate the path ahead. The fragility of hope is not a weakness. It is a sign that Morty still feels, still cares, still reaches for something better, even when the world around him makes reaching difficult. At night, when he is finally still, Morty holds on to that fragile spark. It glows faintly, reminding him that despite everything he has seen, there is something in him that refuses to collapse. That spark is the reason he keeps going. It is the reason he has not fallen into despair. It is the reason he continues to grow, even as fear shadows his steps. Morty does not need strong hope to survive. He needs only the kind that refuses to disappear. This fragile hope is what shapes his path toward adulthood, even if it trembles in his hands.
Morty lives with a constant awareness that his life is not singular. There are versions of him scattered across infinite realities, each shaped by different choices, different traumas, different families, and different encounters with Rick. Most people grow up believing they have one future, one timeline, one self to become. Morty knows otherwise. He knows that identity is not fixed. He knows that versions of him exist who are colder, stronger, weaker, broken, corrupted, missing, or lost. This knowledge does something to him. It creates a shadow, a silhouette of what he could become, and that shadow follows him quietly through his adolescence. It shapes his fears in ways he cannot always name. It deepens his anxiety about growing up, because he has seen that adulthood is not a destination. It is a spectrum, and some parts of that spectrum terrify him. Morty tries not to think about the other versions of himself, but he cannot avoid their presence. They appear in memories, in warnings, in nightmares, in passing comments from Rick. Sometimes they appear physically, standing in front of him, showing him what happens when a different choice shapes the path. These encounters carve themselves into Morty's mind. He sees what fear does to him in different contexts, what anger does, what guilt does, what power does. Each version becomes a mirror he does not want to look into. He tries to tell himself that he is different, that he will not become them, but the universe does not offer reassurance. The universe offers possibility, and possibility is terrifying when it reveals your darkest outcomes. Morty begins to fear that growing up will push him closer to one of these shadows. He wonders which version he will become. He wonders if there is a path where he remains compassionate, one where he remains steady, one where he remains himself. The uncertainty eats at him. Most teenagers worry about who they want to be. Morty worries about who he might become against his will. The pressure of potential futures makes every small decision feel loaded. He hesitates not just because he fears consequences, but because he fears becoming someone he would not recognize. This fear becomes one of the quiet forces guiding his inner life. The presence of these alternate selves also creates an identity crisis that Morty cannot fully articulate. When he looks in the mirror, he sometimes wonders if he is the real Morty or just another variation in a long line. He questions what makes him unique. He questions whether his struggles matter when infinite versions of him face similar or worse challenges. He questions whether his attempts at growth can survive the chaotic influence of Rick. Identity becomes a puzzle with missing pieces. Growing up becomes a maze instead of a path, and Morty does not know which direction leads to safety. Rick's behavior only intensifies this crisis. Rick treats the multiverse with casual disregard. He sees infinite versions of every person and uses this understanding to detach emotionally. When Morty tries to assert his own individuality, Rick sometimes undermines it with a single remark. He hints that Morty is replaceable. He hints that Morty is typical. He hints that Morty is simply one iteration among many. These comments cut deeper than Rick realizes. Morty hears them and feels himself shrinking, not physically but existentially. He wonders if growing up means accepting that he is just another version of something larger than he understands. Morty also begins to understand that the shadow of what he could be includes the possibility of repeating Rick's mistakes. When he sees versions of himself shaped by resentment or trauma, he recognizes some of Rick's traits in them. The same detachment, the same frustration, the same hollow space where innocence used to be. Morty fears these traits in himself. He fears that growing up under Rick's influence will mold him into someone cynical, someone numb, someone cruel. This fear does not come from judgment. Morty understands Rick's pain, but Morty does not want to inherit that pain. He does not want to carry it into his future. He wants a life that feels real, connected and grounded, not one defined by endless running. Another aspect of the shadow that frightens Morty is the knowledge that he has potential for darkness. Morty tries to believe he is good, but he has moments of anger that surprise him, moments of frustration that feel stronger than they should, moments of resentment toward Rick, toward his family, toward himself. He worries that these emotions are signs of a darker version waiting inside him. He remembers the things he has done under pressure, things he regrets, things that haunt him. He wonders if these actions reveal part of his true nature, or if they were simply reactions to impossible circumstances. The uncertainty creates an internal tension that never fully leaves him. Morty also grapples with the fear that he might lose the qualities he values most in himself. Compassion, vulnerability, sensitivity, hope, patience. These qualities feel delicate when placed against the scale of the multiverse. He sees other versions of himself who lost these traits after a single traumatic event. He sees versions who hardened quickly, who shut down emotionally, who surrendered to fear or bitterness. Morty worries that growing up might gradually erode the parts of him that make him human. He tries to protect those qualities, but the effort exhausts him. Each day becomes a fight to remain himself, and the shadow of who he might become makes the fight heavier. There is also the fear of repetition. Morty knows that cycles repeat themselves across timelines. He knows that events echo in different forms. He worries that certain outcomes may be inevitable, that no matter how hard he tries, he might still fall into patterns he despises. This fear makes him cautious, sometimes too cautious. It makes him second-guess actions that should be simple. It makes him worry that every choice is a step toward or away from a shadow he cannot escape.
Morty's fear deepens when he realizes that even the best versions of himself carry scars. He understands that no path is free from pain. He knows that growth often requires loss, but he wonders how much loss he can handle before he becomes someone different. He wonders if there is a future where he can grow without breaking. These questions do not have clear answers, and the absence of clarity becomes another shadow he cannot shake. Despite all this, Morty does not collapse under the weight of his potential futures. He continues to make choices with sincerity. He continues to care deeply. He continues to reach for compassion, even when fear whispers that caring might lead to pain. This persistence reveals something important. Morty's fear does not control him. It shapes him, but it does not define him. He is aware of the shadows, but he does not submit to them. He moves forward with trembling steps, but he moves forward. There are quiet moments when Morty proves to himself that his path is not predetermined, when he chooses kindness even in fear, when he forgives someone who hurt him, when he comforts a stranger, when he refuses to let cynicism harden him. These small moments become anchors. They remind him that identity is not shaped by possibility but by action. They remind him that the shadow of who he could be is only a warning, not a destiny. Morty fears growing up because he fears losing control over the person he becomes. But control is not lost when he acknowledges the shadow. Control is gained through awareness. Morty is learning slowly and painfully that understanding his potential futures helps him shape his present. He sees what he does not want to become and uses that knowledge to guide his choices. This awareness becomes a form of emotional intelligence. It becomes a tool for navigating adolescence. It becomes a quiet strength that Rick does not notice, but one that shapes Morty's character in profound ways. At night, when he thinks about the versions of himself scattered across realities, Morty feels a mixture of fear and determination. He knows he cannot control everything. He knows the universe is chaotic and unpredictable. But he also knows that his path is still his own. The shadow will always be there, but so will the light he carries. As long as that light remains, Morty can shape his future, even if the path is uncertain. Growing up is frightening when the multiverse shows you what you might become. But Morty's fear is also proof that he cares deeply about the person he will be, and that alone sets him apart from every shadow that follows him. There is a moment Morty faces after almost every adventure, a moment that rarely gets seen by anyone else. It happens after the adrenaline fades, after the shouting stops, after the danger has been escaped or defeated or barely survived. Rick is already moving on, tinkering with something in the garage or muttering about the next idea. Morty's family is living their ordinary routines, unaware of the scale of what just occurred. The universe has returned to its usual hum, vast and uncaring. But Morty is still carrying the echo of what happened. He feels it in his chest, in his breathing, in his hands. The silence after the chaos is where Morty feels the truth of growing up most intensely. It is in that quiet space that the fear settles, the understanding deepens, and the emotional weight becomes unmistakable. Morty sits in his room after these experiences, staring at the floor or the wall or his hands without really seeing them. His thoughts scatter before they can form sentences. His body remembers the fear even when his mind tries to move forward. He wonders why the silence feels louder than the chaos. He wonders why the calm always feels like a reminder rather than a relief. Morty realizes that when life becomes unpredictable, silence stops being peaceful. It becomes a blank space where old emotions return. It becomes a mirror that reflects the parts of him he tries to hide. This silence shows Morty something he does not know how to admit. He is not just afraid of the universe, he is afraid of the way the universe has changed him. During the chaos, he reacts instinctively. He runs, hides, shouts, fights, negotiates, adapts. But afterward, when everything is still,
He begins to understand how close he was to breaking. The silence forces him to examine his fear, and that examination is painful. Morty begins to fear the quiet because it reveals too much. It reveals how much he has grown. It reveals how much he has lost. In the silence, Morty replays moments that terrified him. He hears the sounds again. He sees the images again. His mind brings back fragments he did not have time to process during the adrenaline. This is not something he chooses. It happens involuntarily, like his brain is sorting through trauma without his permission. Morty tries to push the memories away, but they cling to him. Growing up, for Morty, means facing these memories alone. No one else is in his room with him. No one else is asking if he is all right. No one else is guiding him through the aftermath. The silence becomes the place where he must learn to navigate his own emotions. Morty also becomes aware that the silence makes him different from his peers. They go home after school or after a bad day and relax. Their silence is simple. Their silence is filled with music, social media, homework, or sleep. Morty's silence is filled with the weight of existence. He sits in bed trying to calm his thoughts while knowing that somewhere out there, another version of himself might be dying or suffering or losing hope. He knows that Rick might be preparing another mission that will push him past his limits again. The silence becomes a reminder that peace is temporary. Growing up becomes frightening because it seems to promise even more responsibility, even more chaos, and even deeper silences afterward. There is another layer to Morty's fear in the quiet moments. After chaos, he sometimes realizes that he acted in ways he did not expect. He remembers moments of bravery that felt more like instinct than choice. He remembers moments of panic that made him freeze. He remembers moments where he spoke up against Rick despite shaking. The silence forces him to study these actions. He wonders whether they reflect who he is becoming, or whether they were reactions to overwhelming fear. He does not know which answer scares him more. Growing up means understanding your patterns, but Morty's patterns are shaped by trauma. The silence becomes a space where he questions everything about himself. Morty also experiences a strange emotional emptiness during these quiet periods. After intense danger, the body sometimes shuts down emotionally as a form of protection. Morty feels this numbing effect and worries about it. He worries that he is becoming desensitized. He worries that one day he will feel nothing at all after something terrible. He worries that he might become too much like Rick. The numbness frightens him more than fear does. Fear means he is still human. Numbness means he is losing something important. The silence after chaos becomes a test. Morty checks whether he can still care. He checks whether he can still cry. He checks whether he can still feel anything at all. Morty's fear of growing up deepens because he senses that adulthood is filled with silences like these. He imagines a future where life keeps presenting impossible challenges, followed by quiet moments where he must face the emotional debris alone. He imagines becoming someone who carries heavy memories without sharing them. He imagines growing resilient in ways that leave scars no one else can see. This vision of adulthood feels lonely. It feels overwhelming. Morty does not want to become someone who spends every quiet night confronting the consequences of chaos. Yet that is the life he seems to be growing into. There are times when Morty tries to break the silence by talking to someone. He approaches his family, hoping for connection. But the gap in understanding is too wide. He tries to talk to Rick, hoping for guidance, but Rick dismisses the vulnerability. He tries to talk to his sister, but he fears burdening her. These failed attempts reinforce the idea that the silence belongs to him alone. That growing up means learning to carry emotions quietly. That fear does not always have a place to go. Morty begins to develop an emotional independence he never asked for. This independence gives him strength, but it also isolates him. Morty fears the quiet moments because they also reveal what he yearns for. He yearns for reassurance. He yearns for someone to tell him that he is doing well, that he is handling impossible situations with courage, that he is allowed to feel overwhelmed. He yearns for someone to sit with him in the silence, and acknowledge the emotional weight without minimizing it. Growing up involves wanting things you cannot admit you want, and Morty's deepest desire is for emotional safety. The silence after chaos shows him how badly he needs it and how rarely he receives it. Yet Morty finds something meaningful in the silence too. Over time, he begins to notice that the quiet moments teach him about resilience. They teach him that he can survive fear. They teach him that he can reflect without falling apart. They teach him that he can rebuild himself after each chaotic moment. Morty discovers that silence, while painful, also gives him space to grow. It gives him space to understand himself. It gives him space to process the emotions he cannot express during danger. It becomes a classroom where he learns the lessons that no one else can teach him. Morty notices that each time he sits through the silence, he emerges slightly stronger. Not stronger in the physical sense, not stronger in confidence, but stronger in emotional endurance. He learns to breathe slowly after panic. He learns to calm his own thoughts. He learns to sit with fear instead of running from it. This is not the kind of strength that people praise. It is quiet, unnoticed, internal, but it is real. It is the kind of strength that adulthood demands, even though it forms painfully. Morty does not realize it yet, but this ability to endure silence will become one of the most important parts of his growth. He is learning how to hold space for his own vulnerability. He is learning how to stay present with emotions that feel overwhelming. He is learning how to understand himself even when the universe refuses to make sense. These lessons are difficult, and they come at a cost, but they shape Morty into someone capable of navigating complexity with empathy and patience. At night, when Morty finally drifts into sleep, the silence rests gently for a moment. It does not disappear. It waits. It remains part of him. But he has survived it again, and surviving the silence becomes its own form of courage. Morty fears growing up because he fears becoming lost in these quiet moments, but he continues to face them with honesty. That honesty becomes the foundation of his emotional strength. In the silence after chaos, Morty grows in ways he cannot yet see. Morty never set out to be extraordinary. He never asked for the universe to unfold in front of him like a chaotic map he could never fully read. He never expected to visit planets that felt like nightmares or dreamscapes or broken mirrors of reality. He never imagined he would meet versions of himself that frightened him, or versions of Rick that reminded him of everything he feared about adulthood. What Morty wanted, at his core, was simple. A normal life, a stable routine, a future he could picture without flinching. But as he grows, he begins to understand that the life he wanted moves farther away with each passing adventure. The distance between who he is becoming and who he once thought he would be becomes another source of fear he cannot escape. When Morty looks at kids his age, he notices their world is still small. They worry about weekend plans. They worry about school assignments. They worry about friendships and crushes and how they appear to others. Morty envies this simplicity because he once lived inside it too. He used to think his biggest problems would involve fitting in or figuring out who he wanted to be. But now, when he tries to place himself inside that picture, he feels like an outsider. His experiences have pulled him into a different lane, one that no one else around him is traveling. The life he wanted feels like a memory that keeps slipping through his fingers. Morty tries to pretend sometimes. He tries to re-enter conversations with his classmates, to laugh easily, to join small talk about mundane things. But every attempt feels like stepping into a world he no longer belongs to. He cares about them, but he feels distant. He is aware of dangers they cannot imagine. He carries knowledge they will never encounter. He feels older in ways he cannot describe. And when he tries to participate in their world, the distance becomes clearer. He realizes how much he has changed, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. This distance appears at home too. Morty sits at the dinner table listening to discussions about normal life, and he wants to join in. He wants to care about the same things his family discusses. But his mind wanders toward memories of planets breaking apart, or timelines collapsing, or creatures communicating in ways that challenged his understanding of empathy. The mundane becomes surreal to him. The normal becomes fragile. He feels caught between worlds. He tries to hold on to the life he wanted, but it no longer fits comfortably around him. Morty begins to wonder who he would have become without Rick. Would he have been someone confident, someone social, someone who believed in his future without hesitation, someone who grew up slowly, gently, at a pace that matched his emotional needs? Morty does not resent Rick for altering his path, but he does mourn the version of himself he will never meet. The distance between his current self and his imagined self becomes a quiet grief that grows the older he gets. This grief deepens his fear of growing up, because growing up feels like walking farther away from the version of himself he once expected to become. He tries to shape a future for himself anyway. He tries to imagine where he might be in a few years. But every attempt feels unstable. He imagines himself in school, but the reality of danger makes it hard to believe education will matter in the long run. He imagines himself in a relationship, but his experience with loss makes connection feel risky. He imagines himself building a family someday, but his exposure to infinite realities makes permanence feel uncertain. Morty does not lack imagination. He lacks stability, the foundation needed to build a picture of adulthood that feels solid. The distance between him and the life he wanted also grows because Morty feels responsible for things he should not have to carry. He sees the flaws in his family and tries to support them. He sees the instability of his home life and tries to compensate. He sees Rick's emotional chaos and tries to hold the pieces together quietly. Morty does all of this because he cares deeply. But this care stretches him. It changes him. It forces him to grow in directions he never chose, directions that move him even farther from a simpler life. Morty also realizes that the life he wanted relied on innocence. He wanted to trust adults. He wanted to believe that the world made sense. He wanted to believe that problems had solutions and that people could be relied on. Growing up has shown him that these beliefs are fragile. He still wants to trust, but trust has become complicated. He still wants answers, but answers come with costs. He still wants reliability, but reliability is rare in a universe shaped by chaos. Morty sees these truths, and although he accepts them, they make him miss the ease of his earlier expectations. The distance becomes especially painful when Morty tries to enjoy simple things, watching a show, playing a game, spending time with friends. These activities bring him joy, but the joy feels thinner than it used to. Not because he no longer enjoys them, but because he is aware of everything happening outside those moments. The universe feels too large to ignore. The dangers feel too real to dismiss. The life he wanted used to be enough. Now it feels like a hiding place he can only enter for a short time before reality pulls him back out. Morty fears that this distance will keep growing. He fears that every adventure will push him farther from normalcy, farther from connection, farther from whatever stability he hopes to find. He fears that one day he will look at his old dreams and feel nothing for them. He fears that growing up will mean accepting that the life he wanted is gone forever. This fear does not come from self-pity. It comes from an awareness that experience shapes identity, and Morty's experiences have been extreme. Despite this, Morty still reaches for moments that ground him. He still tries to connect with his family when he can. He still tries to build friendships. He still tries to pursue things that make him feel human. These attempts matter. They show that Morty has not surrendered to the distance. He is still trying to bridge the gap, even when it feels impossible. There is a moment Morty faces often. When he is lying in bed at night, he thinks about the life he wanted, the one that feels so far away. He pictures it quietly, not with bitterness, but with longing. He imagines a universe where danger is not constant, a universe where he can grow at his own pace, a universe where his fears are manageable instead of cosmic. these fantasies do not hurt him. They comfort him. They remind him that he still wants something better. That desire keeps him tethered to hope. It shows that even as he changes, even as he grows in ways he did not choose, he still knows what matters to him. Morty may never return to the life he wanted, but the longing for it guides him. It helps him hold on to compassion. It helps him stay grounded. It helps him resist becoming indifferent. The distance between him and the life he wanted teaches him that identity is not defined by circumstances. It is defined by what you choose to hold on to. Morty fears growing up because he fears losing sight of what he once wanted. But the truth is that this longing shapes him more deeply than any adventure could. It keeps him connected to the humanity that the universe tries to take from him. And as long as he remembers that distant life, he carries a piece of it with him into every chaotic moment. Morty has always felt small, not just in the sense that he is young or overlooked, but in the deeper sense that he stands next to forces larger than anything he can truly understand. When you stand beside someone like Rick, someone who bends the rules of reality with his hands and dismisses danger with a shrug, it is easy to feel like your presence hardly matters. Morty senses this constantly. He feels the weight of his own insignificance pressing against him, shaping his understanding of his place in the universe. And as he grows, this feeling evolves into something more complicated, something more frightening. Morty does not just fear being small, he fears becoming invisible. This invisibility begins subtly. It happens in moments when Rick moves through an entire crisis without asking for Morty's input, as if Morty is simply a background character in Rick's endless improvisation. Morty tries to follow along, but he feels like he could vanish for a few seconds and nothing would change. Rick would keep talking. Rick would keep planning. Rick would keep existing without noticing the absence. Morty does not resent Rick for this, but he feels the sting of it. The fear that he could disappear from Rick's side and the universe would not blink becomes one of the quiet fears that grows with him. Morty also notices this invisibility at home. His family loves him, but they are caught in their own patterns. His mother is preoccupied. His father is insecure. His sister is navigating her own confusions. Morty sits at the table listening to conversations about tasks and days and routines, and he wonders if anyone can sense how much he has changed. He wonders if anyone sees that he carries memories that do not belong in the mind of a kid his age. He wonders if anyone notices when he is overwhelmed. It frightens him to think that he could sit among the people he loves most and still feel unseen. Invisibility becomes even more real when Morty compares himself to the infinite versions of himself scattered across the multiverse. He knows that he shares his identity with countless others, that his existence is not unique in the grand scheme of things. This knowledge creates a strange emotional dissonance. On one hand, Morty feels the pressure of being responsible for his own life. On the other hand, he feels like a copy of a copy, part of an endless pattern that the universe would not miss if something went wrong. This dual awareness erodes his confidence. It makes him question his importance. It makes him fear growing up into someone whose choices feel meaningless. Morty also begins to fear invisibility in his relationships. He worries that as he grows older, he will become harder to understand. He fears that the more he experiences, the more he will drift away emotionally from the people who care about him. He fears that they will not notice his internal struggles because he has become too good at hiding them. Growing up often involves learning to manage your emotions privately, but Morty's emotional world is a labyrinth. He fears that the people who could help him navigate it will never know the maze exists. This fear intensifies when Morty watches how Rick interacts with the world. Rick's intelligence makes him untouchable in ways Morty cannot relate to. Rick does not need validation. Rick does not need reassurance. Rick does not need visibility because he is detached from the emotional structures that make visibility meaningful. Morty tries to understand this, but he cannot imitate it. He still wants to be seen. He still wants to matter. He still wants to feel that his presence in the universe is not just incidental. Growing up under someone who dismisses his significance makes this desire even stronger, but it also makes it more painful. Morty's fear of becoming invisible becomes especially intense when he remembers times he has spoken up only to be ignored. He remembers moments when he tried to articulate his fears, his doubts, his moral objections. He remembers Rick brushing these concerns aside as if they were distractions. He remembers his family interrupting him or talking over him without meaning to. Every one of these moments becomes a small confirmation of a quiet dread. He wonders if growing up means learning to accept that some people will never truly see him. Yet Morty is not invisible. He influences events in ways he does not acknowledge. He changes the outcomes of adventures. He challenges Rick when no one else dares. He grounds his family with his presence. But Morty does not always recognize this influence because it often goes unspoken. He looks for validation in words, not in actions, and he rarely receives it. Growing up means learning to interpret unspoken appreciation, but Morty is still young. He still needs clarity. Without it, he worries that his place in the universe is fragile. Morty fears invisibility because he fears irrelevance. He wants to matter not in a grand heroic sense, but in the quiet human sense. He wants someone to notice when he is hurting. He wants someone to understand when he is overwhelmed. He wants someone to acknowledge the emotional labor he performs every day just to stay functional. He fears growing up because adulthood seems to magnify invisibility. Adults learn to hide their struggles. Adults learn to endure without expressing vulnerability. Morty sees this pattern and feels a chill run through him. The fear grows deeper when Morty thinks about the future. Will he be someone whose voice gets lost in the noise of existence? Will he become someone whose needs are always overshadowed by the needs of others? Will he grow into someone who fades into the background because he never learned to assert himself? Morty does not want this. He does not want to grow into a life where he feels unseen, but he does not know how to prevent it. The universe he has seen does not promise recognition. It promises chaos. It promises risk. It promises the possibility of loss. There is a moment at school that strikes Morty unexpectedly. He hears his name called almost casually by someone who barely knows him, and for a second, he feels a strange warmth. The acknowledgement is small, insignificant to most, but to Morty it means something. It reminds him that being seen does not require grandeur. It requires presence. It requires connection. These small reminders keep him going. They make him believe that invisibility is not inevitable. Morty also finds visibility in unexpected places. Sometimes a stranger during an adventure looks at him with gratitude. Sometimes a creature he rescues responds with recognition. Sometimes Rick, in a rare moment of clarity, acknowledges Morty's effort with a brief comment that Morty remembers for days. These moments break the pattern of invisibility. They show Morty that he is not fading. They remind him that even in a universe as vast as the one he travels through, he leaves impressions behind. Morty's fear of becoming invisible teaches him something important about himself. He understands the value of empathy because he knows what it feels like to be ignored. He understands the value of listening because he knows how rare it is. He understands the value of acknowledging someone's presence because he knows how painful it is when that presence is overlooked. This understanding shapes him more than any adventure. It becomes part of the emotional foundation he carries into adulthood. At night, when Morty lies in bed thinking about the day, he wonders if anyone truly knows him. He wonders if someday he will become someone who is impossible to overlook or someone who blends into the background of existence. These thoughts weigh heavily on him, but they do not crush him. Morty still wants to be seen, and wanting to be seen is itself a sign that he has not vanished into the shadows. His desire for connection keeps him anchored to the world.
even when the world feels indifferent. Morty fears growing up because he fears disappearing. But every day, in small ways, he continues to exist boldly. He continues to feel deeply. He continues to shape the people around him more than he realizes. He continues to push against invisibility simply by caring. And in a universe as chaotic as his, caring is the most visible act of all.
Morty lives in a universe where control slips through his fingers the moment he reaches for it. He tries to steady himself in situations that twist without warning. He tries to make choices that matter, only to watch those choices bend under forces he cannot predict. He tries to guide Rick when Rick spirals, only to realize that Rick does not want guidance. Growing up usually means gaining control over your life. For Morty, growing up means realizing how little control he actually has. This realization becomes one of the most painful truths he carries, and it shapes his fear of adulthood more deeply than anything else. Morty begins to crave control because his life constantly strips it away. In school, he tries to focus, but memories of danger pull him into spirals of anxiety he cannot stop. At home, he tries to contribute to conversations, but Rick's unpredictability always looms in the background. During adventures, he tries to influence outcomes, but the universe responds with indifference. These experiences teach Morty something he does not know how to accept. Even when he tries his hardest, external forces can dismantle his efforts. Control becomes something he reaches for out of desperation, not confidence. The confusion begins with small moments. Morty tries to plan ahead, but Rick interrupts his plans with a mission. Morty tries to speak up, but Rick talks over him. Morty tries to set boundaries only to be pulled into another dangerous situation. These moments seem trivial at first, but they accumulate. They create a pattern. Morty starts to feel like a passenger in his own life. Growing up becomes confusing because he wants autonomy. But autonomy is impossible when someone like Rick stands at the center of his world. Morty's desire for control clashes with his fear of responsibility. He wants to feel capable, but when he is given responsibility, it overwhelms him. He wants to make decisions, but the weight of consequence terrifies him. He wants to be listened to, but he does not want the burden of leading. This contradiction creates an internal conflict that grows the older he gets. Morty begins to wonder whether adulthood means choosing between helplessness and burden. Neither option feels fair. Neither option feels safe. The confusion deepens when Morty tries to assert control emotionally. He wants to regulate his reactions, to stay calm during chaos, to keep his thoughts clear, but fear rises too quickly. Panic appears before logic. Guilt settles before he can defend himself. He tries to be composed, but the universe does not allow composure to grow gently. Morty feels frustrated with himself for not handling situations better, even though no one his age could. This frustration becomes its own form of pressure, a pressure that makes him feel older than he is and younger than he should be. Morty also sees how control influences identity. Rick has total control over his intellect, but almost no control over his emotions. Summer gains control through confidence, but loses control when chaos exposes her vulnerabilities. Beth chases control because she fears becoming her father. Jerry wants control, but collapses under the reality of it. Morty watches all of this and feels stuck. He sees that control can protect people, but can also destroy them. He sees that control can provide stability, but can also isolate them. He does not know which path he wants. He does not know which path is safe. The confusion becomes more intense when Morty realizes he sometimes takes control without meaning to. He steps into leadership roles during adventures because no one else is grounded enough to do it. He persuades strangers during crises because his sincerity cuts through panic. He calms creatures by treating them like beings instead of threats. Morty does not intend to lead, but he does. These moments surprise him. They show him that control can come from empathy, not authority. but they also show him that controlling a situation often means sacrificing his own comfort. The more he tries to steady others, the less stable he feels inside. Morty's fear of growing up heightens when he realizes that control in adulthood is rarely perfect. Adults make mistakes, adults waver, adults break under pressure. He sees this in Rick most clearly. Rick appears to control everything, but Morty sees the cracks. He sees the desperation beneath the genius. He sees the fear Rick refuses to name. He sees the moments where Rick loses control and pretends it does not matter. Morty fears becoming someone who hides behind power to avoid vulnerability. He fears becoming someone who pretends to be strong instead of actually being strong. Control becomes a symbol of what he wants to avoid as much as what he wants to achieve. Morty also begins to fear the moments when he does feel in control, because they come with consequences he did not anticipate. He remembers choices he made with confidence that ended badly. He remembers moments when he acted decisively only to regret the result. These memories create hesitation in him. Morty wants to act boldly, but every bold action reminds him of a time when confidence betrayed him. This creates another contradiction. He wants control, but he does not trust himself with it. There is a moment Morty experiences often while lying in bed at night. He thinks about situations when he acted and situations when he froze. He wonders which version of himself is real. Is he someone who steps up when needed, or someone who collapses under pressure? Morty does not know. The answer shifts depending on the moment. This inconsistency frightens him. Growing up seems to require stability. Morty feels like a collection of opposites, a mixture of confidence and panic, hope and dread, courage and helplessness. Control becomes something he understands intellectually but cannot achieve emotionally. Despite his confusion, Morty does learn something important. He begins to see that control is not something you seize. It is something you build slowly. It comes from understanding yourself, accepting your limitations and growing into your strengths. Morty is not there yet, but he is starting to sense the shape of this truth. He notices that when he focuses on the present moment instead of the bigger picture, he feels more grounded. He notices that when he listens to his instincts, they often guide him well. He notices that when he acts out of compassion instead of fear, he feels more capable. Morty is learning, even if he does not realize it. He is learning that control does not require perfection. It requires intention. It requires awareness. It requires patience. These lessons form slowly in him, shaped by both chaos and quiet moments. They guide him toward a different kind of adulthood than the one he fears. Morty fears growing up because he fears facing a future he cannot steady. But he is beginning to understand that control is not about preventing chaos. It is about surviving it without losing yourself. Morty still confuses these ideas, but confusion is part of his journey. Confusion means he is thinking deeply. Confusion means he is aware. Confusion means he still believes he can find answers. At night, when he breathes through the uncertainty and tries to calm his mind, Morty begins to trust that control will come in time, not all at once, not perfectly, but gradually, through the moments that scare him and the moments that teach him. He grows each time he faces the confusion honestly, and that honesty becomes the quiet beginning of control. Morty does not fear mistakes in the way most kids his age do. For them, a mistake might lead to embarrassment or a bad grade or a temporary argument. For Morty, a mistake can shatter worlds. A mistake can unravel timelines. A mistake can cause harm he never intended, harm that cannot be undone. Each decision he makes carries the potential to leave a scar on someone or something, and this awareness becomes one of the heaviest weights he carries as he grows. It shapes how he sees himself, how he navigates situations, and how he understands the future. Mistakes are no longer simple. They echo, they return, they linger, they follow him. This echo begins early, before Morty even understands its magnitude. He remembers times when he hesitated at the wrong moment, times when he trusted the wrong instinct, times when he acted too quickly. These moments haunt him not because he believes he is fundamentally flawed, but because he knows he is young and still learning. The universe does not give him time to learn safely. It tests him before he is ready, and every test leaves behind consequences that no one his age should have to carry. Morty fears growing up because he fears accumulating too many echoes, fears becoming someone defined by mistakes instead of growth. He tries to brush off the guilt, tries to remind himself that he is doing his best, but the memories return with clarity in moments of silence. He hears his own voice saying something he regrets. He sees images of situations where he failed to protect someone. He relives decisions that spiraled beyond his control. These echoes form a quiet internal chorus that never fully fades. Morty also feels the weight of mistakes he did not make, but still feels responsible for. When Rick makes dangerous choices, Morty sometimes blames himself for not stopping him. When chaos unfolds, Morty wonders if he should have spoken differently, or moved earlier, or argued louder. He begins to believe that responsibility includes preventing mistakes made by others, even when those others have more experience and power than he does. This distorted sense of accountability adds another layer of pressure to his emotional world. The fear intensifies when Morty encounters versions of himself shaped by regret. Some of these alternate selves carry guilt so heavy that it changed who they became. Morty sees what regret can do to a person. He sees how mistakes can fracture identity when they accumulate without support. These encounters frighten him because he understands that he is not immune to the same fate. He knows that growing up means facing mistakes without collapsing, but he also knows that he is already carrying more than most people ever will. Morty's fear is especially strong during moments when he tries to express regret to someone and is dismissed. Rick often tells him that mistakes do not matter in the multiverse, that outcomes are insignificant, that regret is pointless. Morty hears the words, but they do not settle in him the way Rick expects. Morty feels the emotional reality of every mistake. He carries empathy that cannot be erased through logic. When Rick dismisses regret, Morty feels even more alone with his feelings. He worries that growing up under someone who refuses to process mistakes will leave him unable to heal from his own. Morty also struggles with the fear of repeating mistakes. He notices patterns in himself, times when fear makes him rush, times when panic makes him freeze, times when emotion overwhelms logic. He wants to learn from these patterns, but the environments he faces change too quickly for slow learning. Each adventure throws new variables at him. Each crisis presents different stakes. Morty begins to feel that learning is possible only in theory. In reality, situations move too fast to be corrected gently. This creates a cycle of anxiety. He fears making the same mistake twice, but the lack of stability forces him into reactive states where mistakes are more likely. The echo of every mistake also affects Morty's relationships. He becomes cautious around people, afraid of hurting them accidentally. He hesitates to form new connections because he worries that he might fail them. He judges himself harshly when he disappoints someone. This self-criticism grows stronger the older he gets. Morty begins to fear that adulthood will only magnify this sensitivity until it becomes overwhelming. There is another dimension to Morty's fear. He knows that mistakes change people. He sees it in Rick. Rick carries regrets that he refuses to acknowledge, and those regrets have shaped him into someone isolated and emotionally scarred. Morty fears following that path. He fears becoming someone who suppresses guilt until it mutates into cynicism. He fears becoming someone who hurts others because he cannot process the pain inside him. The echoes of mistakes reveal not just what he fears doing, but what he fears becoming. Morty also carries the burden of moral mistakes, ones that are ambiguous rather than clear. There are times when he chooses survival over compassion, times when he trusts the wrong ally, times when he accepts Rick's logic even when it conflicts with his own. These moments weigh on him because they reveal the complexity of morality in a chaotic universe. Morty does not want to make harmful choices, but sometimes he has no good options. Growing up means learning to live with imperfect decisions, but Morty is still learning how to accept imperfection without blaming himself completely. There is a moment Morty faces often late at night. He thinks about everything he could have done differently. He replays words he wishes he had not said. He reimagines situations where a small change might have shifted the entire outcome. These thoughts swirl around him until they become heavy. But they also reveal something important. Morty cares about his impact. He cares about the people affected by his choices. He cares enough to reflect deeply. This care is not weakness. It is emotional maturity forming through struggle. Despite his fear, Morty gradually begins to understand that mistakes teach him things no one else can. They teach him compassion. They teach him humility. They teach him awareness. They teach him to pause before acting. They teach him to speak up even when he is scared. These lessons accumulate too, forming a second echo within him, one that balances the pain. The echo of growth, quieter but steady. Each mistake that haunts him also pushes him toward becoming someone stronger. Morty may not realize it, but he is developing resilience through every moment that scares him. He learns to forgive himself slowly. He learns to differentiate between mistakes that were avoidable and mistakes that were inevitable. He learns to give himself grace even when others do not. This growth does not erase the echoes of regret, but it softens them. It gives him room to breathe. Morty fears growing up because he fears piling mistakes on top of each other until he cannot carry the weight. But he does not see that he has already survived more than most adults ever will. He has navigated guilt without losing empathy. He has processed consequences without becoming numb. He has faced reflection without falling apart. These abilities are proof that he will continue to grow without being crushed by the echoes. At night, when Morty finally manages to quiet his thoughts, he realizes something simple and profound. The fact that he cares about his mistakes means he is already becoming someone different from the versions of himself who collapsed under regret. He is not defined by the echoes. He is defined by the way he listens to them. And listening, even when it hurts, is the beginning of healing. Morty lives in a world that changes faster than he can prepare for. Every day brings new dangers, new experiences, and new emotional challenges that reshape him in subtle ways. He feels himself changing, sometimes gently, sometimes violently, and he does not always know how to interpret it. Growing up is supposed to be a gradual progression, a slow unfolding of identity. But for Morty, identity forms under pressure. It forms in moments of terror, of loss, of wonder, of guilt, and of fleeting hope. It forms without warning. It forms in silence and in chaos. And because of this, Morty fears something deeper than the universe, deeper than danger, deeper even than Rick. Morty fears the person he will wake up as tomorrow. This fear is not irrational. It comes from watching how quickly experiences can break or reshape someone. He has seen Rick change from moment to moment, shifting masks depending on the situation. He has seen versions of himself whose personalities hardened after a single traumatic day. He has seen entire realities altered by choices that seemed small at the time. Morty begins to understand that identity is fragile. It bends with circumstances. It adapts whether you want it to or not. The person he is now is not the person he was a year ago or even a few weeks ago. He feels the changes inside him, subtle shifts in how he sees the world, subtle shifts in how he reacts, subtle shifts in what he hopes for. These shifts frighten him because he does not know what direction they lead. Morty fears waking up one morning and realizing he no longer cares as much as he used to. He fears losing tenderness. He fears losing hope. He fears losing the instinct to comfort others. These traits define him. They are the parts of himself he cherishes the most. But he has seen kindness fade in other versions of himself. He knows that compassion can be worn down by exhaustion. He knows that sensitivity can feel like a weakness in a dangerous world. He knows that the more he grows, the more he risks losing the qualities that make him feel alive. This fear presses against him quietly whenever he feels himself becoming numb after an overwhelming day. He lies awake, testing himself, checking whether he still feels enough, whether his heart still reacts to things that matter. Morty also fears becoming someone who mirrors Rick in the wrong ways. The more time he spends with Rick, the more he absorbs Rick's worldview, even when he tries not to. He starts predicting Rick's reactions before they happen. He starts imitating Rick's logic during moments of crisis. He starts understanding Rick's cynicism in ways he never wanted to understand. Morty cares for Rick, but he does not want to become someone who hides behind indifference. He does not want to become someone who avoids vulnerability. He does not want to become someone who stops believing in emotional honesty. Morty sees a version of adulthood in Rick that is brilliant but lonely, powerful but fractured. The thought that he might grow into someone similar gnaws at him. Another part of this fear comes from watching his family struggle with their own identities. Morty sees how adulthood has shaped his parents. He sees Beth's insecurities, her desire for control, her fear of stagnation. He sees Jerry's fragility, his tendency to avoid responsibility, his yearning for validation. He sees Summer's rapid growth, how she tries to balance confidence with sensitivity. Morty realizes that growing up is not a clean transformation. It is messy, it is chaotic, it exposes weaknesses you never knew you had. Morty fears what adulthood will expose inside him. He wonders if the insecurities he feels now will evolve into deeper faults later. He wonders if the mistakes he makes now will solidify into patterns. Morty also fears becoming someone who forgets the life he wanted. He fears waking up one day and realizing that the distance between him and his childhood dreams has stretched too far for him to return. He fears settling into a version of life that feels hollow, shaped more by circumstance than intention. Morty does not want to become someone who drifts, someone who accepts a future without meaning. He wants to build something for himself, but the instability of the universe makes long-term intentions feel impossible. This uncertainty becomes another source of fear. The most painful part of Morty's fear comes from the awareness that he is changing even when he tries to stay the same. Some days he feels bolder than before, some days he feels colder, some days he feels wiser, some days he feels lost. These shifts happen without warning. Morty does not know which version of himself is the real one. He wonders if stability will ever come. Growing up should offer increased clarity, but Morty feels like clarity drifts farther away the older he gets. This confusion becomes a quiet tension he carries everywhere. There is a moment Morty experiences often, right as he wakes up. For a few seconds his mind is blank and peaceful. Then memories flood in. His heart shifts as he remembers who he was the day before. He wonders if the person he wakes up as today will be the same by evening. He notices things in himself that change daily, how he reacts to stress, how he interprets silence, how he processes anger, how he holds hope. This awareness makes him feel unsteady. He feels like he is balancing between versions of himself without knowing which version will last. Morty fears the future because he fears becoming someone unrecognizable. But he does not realize another truth forming beneath this fear. The fact that he worries about who he becomes means that he is already shaping his path with intention. People who lose themselves do not worry about the loss. Morty worries because he cares. He worries because he is thoughtful. He worries because he wants to grow in a direction that aligns with his values, even if he struggles to define those values.
Clearly, the truth Morty slowly begins to understand is that growth is not a straight line. It is a series of shifts, setbacks, realizations, and small victories. He is learning to adjust. He is learning to recover from fear. He is learning to rebuild after emotional exhaustion. These abilities form identity quietly, from the inside out. Morty fears change, but he also endures it. He adapts with more strength than he gives himself credit for. Another important truth begins to form in him. The fear of who he will become is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of awareness. It is a sign of emotional depth. It is a sign that he holds himself to standards shaped by compassion and vulnerability. Morty does not want to become numb. Morty does not want to repeat the mistakes he has seen in Rick or in alternate versions of himself. Morty does not want to surrender his humanity. The fear of losing these parts of himself protects him from losing them. Morty still lies awake some nights imagining futures that frighten him, but he also imagines futures that comfort him. Futures where he grows stronger without becoming cold. Futures where he builds relationships based on trust. Futures where he finds meaning in small joys. Futures where he remains someone who cares deeply, even after everything. These imagined futures do not erase the fear, but they exist beside it. Morty fears growing up because he fears waking up one day as someone unfamiliar. But every day he proves something quietly. He proves that he still feels. He proves that he still hopes. He proves that he still cares. He proves that he still wants to become someone he can respect. These truths form a foundation beneath the chaos. They hold him steady even when he feels unsteady. Morty does not see the progress he is making, but the progress is there. At night, when Morty closes his eyes after a long day of confusion, mistakes, fear, small victories, and quiet courage, he whispers a simple hope to himself, one he does not dare say aloud. He hopes that tomorrow he will wake up as someone slightly stronger, slightly kinder, slightly more certain. And even if he wakes up scared, he hopes he will still recognize himself. Growing up terrifies him, but he grows anyway. And that is the proof of who he truly is.